And as we dive into the neuroscience of
post-nut clarity,
we'll discover that the effects of post-nut clarity are even more profound than most people realize. And so the way I sort of think about post-nut clarity is it's not just post-nut clarity, it's also pre-nut fog. So prior to orgasm, our brain has so many different dimensions that impair our thinking, impair our ability to even act and be motivated in the right way. Because if people have experienced post-nut clarity, you kind of know that after you nut, right, your mind is super clear. You're able to focus on tasks.
Pre-nut, your mind's like going crazy. Post-nut, yeah.
You're not nearly as distracted. There's really this profound sense of like clarity and direction and motivation. And the really fascinating thing is, as we dig into the neuroscience, we'll see how each of those things that we experience is actually tied to specific circuits in the brain.
All right.
So the first thing is that the neuroscience of orgasm is complicated, okay? What we know is that orgasm is primarily mediated by a flood of opioids in the brain and in the body. So when you have an orgasm, you sort of have this experience of being like blissed out. You feel kind of floaty. And this is a different kind of pleasure from dopamine. When I feel like really, really engaged with something, let's say I'm playing a video game or I'm competing in sports or I'm gambling, right? And I win big. The kind of pleasure that I get feels like a rush, not like a floating in a blissed out kind of way. And as we dig into the effects of an opioid flood in our brain, we actually see that one of the most profound effects is a reduction in dopamine signaling.
Okay, so reduction, but you get floaty. All right, let's see what else he talks about, because
So let's explain that for a second.
Yes,
okay?
please.
So dopamine is the neurotransmitter that does things like creates cravings, gives us pleasure, gives us behavioral reinforcement. When dopamine is super active in our brain, we want things. So if we think a little bit about pre-nut fog, why are we not thinking clearly before we nut? Because it's like, okay, I really want to write this book, let's say, or I want to focus on this project. I want to learn how to paint. But instead, my mind keeps thinking about playing video games, keeps thinking about watching pornography, keeps thinking about lust. Loneliness is at an all-time high. Sexlessness is at an all-time high. Relationships are probably in the worst state they've ever been in the history of humanity. And that's why I made Dr. K's Guide to Love, Sex, and Relationships. Let's talk about who you should actually date. Falling in love is sometimes one of the biggest mistakes that you can make. You know, I started to do a lot of research about how to have like really good sex. Visit healthygamer.gg/guide to learn more. Good luck out there, motherfuckers. Y'all are gonna need it. So
damn.
One of the fogs that we experience is that instead of being like clear towards our goals, our dopaminergic circuitry is pulling us in 1,000 different directions.
Okay.
It kind of induces this brain rot. What's really scary is when our dopamine system is activated, just how much it impairs our decision making and impairs our ability to assess risk.
So basically, so when dudes are horny, they I think he used a scientific term, right? But I know friends that like when they're really horny, they'll go back to this girl's place or whatever, and they're like, yeah, this is really shady, I don't know this girl, you know, like I don't know what I was thinking, and I just went to this like weird place, and yeah, that's what he's talking about. But that's scientifically, but men, like when they're horny, they don't think. Boy.
So overall, numerous studies have shown that when our dopamine circuits are activated, we don't assess risk in the right way, okay? And this is important to understand because post-nut clarity is not just about lust. Post-nut clarity is about clarity in all of the other dimensions of our life. And what we know from some of these studies on dopaminergic activation is that once our dopamine system is activated, it impairs our decision-making in unrelated fields as well. So first thing, impairs decision-making. We make bad bets in blackjack. Second thing about the dopaminergic circuitry is how little sexual stimuli we need to activate this dopaminergic circuitry. So once it becomes activated, we don't think clearly, and it takes very little to actually activate it. There's a really cool study that basically showed a benign image for 474 milliseconds, okay? So almost half a second. And for 26 milliseconds, it showed a sexually explicit image. Now, when we show a sexually explicit image for 26 milliseconds, this is not enough for our brain to consciously register. You won't even know that you saw a sexually explicit image. You won't be consciously aware of it. But that small amount of stimulus is all it takes for your brain to actually light up, right? So we need very little sexual stimuli to trigger these lust pathways. And then what's really scary is once these pathways are triggered, the degree of alteration in our decision making. This is a really cool study that was done out of MIT by Daniel Ariely, who's written multiple best-selling books. But he basically showed people like explicit images, and then he asked people all kinds of questions, like, would you be willing to have sex with a 40-year-old woman, 50-year-old woman, 60-year-old woman? Would you be willing to have sex with someone that you hate? Would you be willing to have sex with a man?
Whoa! Pause. Wait. Hold on a minute. Pause. He said ask. Wait. Did he say ask women or men? Hold on a minute. Let me go back to that. All right. Let me get the subtitles just in case I got it wrong.
This is a really cool study that was done out of MIT by Daniel Ariely, who's written multiple best-selling books. But he basically showed people like explicit images, and then he asked people all kinds of questions.
So he asked people. He didn't specify as men or women.
Like, would you be willing to have sex with a 40-year-old woman, 50-year-old woman, 60-year-old woman?
So it could be a man or a woman. So.
And would you be willing to have sex with someone that you hate? Would you be willing to have sex with a man? And
pause. It could be a guy too, because he said he asked people, didn't specify the sex. Big pause, man. What the heck?
Well, what's really scary about all these questions is once someone gets exposed to these images, how drastically it alters their decision making. Their willingness to engage in sexual behavior goes up by a statistically significant amount in so many different directions. Once you are turned on, two fundamental things happen. One is that for the things that you're attracted to,
magic happens downstairs.
Your willingness to sacrifice for them, engage with them, pursue them actually goes up by a statistically significant amount. And even things that you normally don't find attractive, like do you think women's shoes are erotic? Once you expose someone to a sexual image, their thinking about that changes drastically. So what's really kind of profound about this is not so much the post-nut clarity, but the pre-nut horniness, the pre-nut fog drastically changes the way that we see the world, what we're willing to pursue, and the risks that we're willing to take. So that's the dopaminergic circuitry. But when we get this flood of opioids, we are also recruiting other systems. So we also see an increase in serotonin transmission with the flood of opioids with an orgasm. Floods of serotonin are associated with improved self-esteem. They're associated with an improved sense of contentment.
So you feel really good. You feel like, oh, yeah, I'm the man.
Right? So when we think about the experience of orgasm, there's that body rush of bliss, there's that floatiness, and then we just feel calm and contented. So this will correlate with reductions in anxiety. It'll correlate with improvements in mood, right? And this is also where I want y'all to think about what is it that makes it hard for you to function on a daily basis? What is it that makes it hard for you to be your best self? What is it that clouds your mind? I want to write a book, but I'm distracted by video games. I'm distracted by pornography. I'm thinking lustful thoughts, right? So that's one form of distraction. I can't just focus on the book. But then also I feel like I've got low energy. I have all these thoughts about, okay, well, what if the book doesn't turn out good? It's a waste of time. How do I make sure that all of the energy that I'm willing to invest results in something productive instead of just being a failure? That's kind of depressive thoughts, self-esteem thought, low self-esteem thoughts, anxiety thoughts. So here's a paper that looks at trans orgasm and sexuality, which also sort of shows us that when we experience these orgasmic states, it reduces our ruminative thinking, which kind of overlaps with this serotonin flood that we see from the neuroscience perspective. And this is what's also really interesting. When we enter the state of orgasm, it also changes the way that we think about ourselves. So most of the time as we navigate through the world, we have a lot of self-referential processing going on. What does that mean? That means that if I'm thinking about, I see a cute girl at a coffee shop and I want to go up and talk to her. But as I go up and talk to her, my mind starts hypothesizing. It starts looking into the future and thinking, oh my God, if I say this, I'm going to look like an idiot. And it'll also start thinking about the past. Oh yeah, there was that one time 2 years ago where I approached a cute girl at a coffee shop.
Self-doubt?
And man, I really messed it up and it was really awkward and she seemed really uncomfortable. This flood of opioids that we experience when we nut actually shuts down all of this ruminative, self-referential thinking. What we're actually able to do is be more present in the moment. So this paper refers this to as an extreme sensate focus. Now, what does that mean? So if we sort of think about the way that we live our lives, right? I'm living my life, and then there's a constant commentary in here that's ruminative, thinking about...
Yeah, I mean, we all have that. We're always like, think like, you know, should I do this? You know, I don't think it's a good idea. You know, like we self-doubt and, you know, like you said, ruminate. So, I mean, that's everybody, man.
How I could screw up, thinking about how I've screwed up in the past. And orgasm wipes that away. So when it comes down to it, post-nut clarity is incredibly profound.
Ooh,
it affects our dopaminergic circuitry, which in turn affects how much we want things, how distracted we are by things, our judgment and decision-making. It affects our risk threshold. So a lot of the mistakes that we make are because we're really thirsty or really horny, right? So it reduces all of that kind of stuff. And remember that this dopaminergic blunting exists outside of realms that are related to sexuality. So even our draw towards video games and other dopaminergic activities, because this dopaminergic circuitry is literally inhibited. So it doesn't matter what the dopaminergic activity is, all of it becomes inhibited. It reduces our rumination. It reduces our self-referential processing, which in turn means that we're able to focus on the tasks that we're passionate about, that we're interested about. I don't know if this makes sense, but when you experience post-nut clarity, it's almost like you have an armor to all of the things that normally cause you problems. And that's the real nature of the clarity. So as we talk about post-nut clarity, there's a really common, question that people will ask me, which is like, what about NoFap? Right? So like if I start taking cold showers, if I stop masturbating, if I like don't watch pornography anymore, will that induce the same state as post-nut clarity? Because oftentimes what people who are engaging with NoFap are doing is they're trying to wrestle themselves away from the controlling influence of horniness and lust. And they're sort of right on the money. So here's a really cool paper from the Buddhist tradition that sort of talks about the baseline state of mind is clear. And when the mind is clear, like it's supposed to be, then we can focus on tasks. We can devote ourselves to, doing things that are productive.
That means if you don't bust a nut or like are slave to like sex, right? So like porn, OnlyFans, all that stuff, then you have, I guess you're saying like a clarity, like you're able to focus. That's not like, you're not a slave to that stuff anymore. Or like bound to it.
If we can stay on task, our attentional performance increases, right? This is good. To have a clear mind, it feels really, really, really good. And what this paper also says is that our baseline state is to have a clear mind. And things like lust, things like anger, things like belligerence, these are the things that cloud our mind. So the problem with NoFap is you can stop the sexual activity, but as long as the lustfulness is there, as long as the lustfulness is activating that dopaminergic circuitry, then the cloudiness will be there. So it isn't sufficient to do NoFap. What you really have to do is like spiritually progress to adopt a sense of non-lustfulness.
How do you do that?
The challenge with NoFap is it isn't clear to...
I mean, that is hard in today's society. I mean, like, to be honest with you, like, because you're constantly bombarded on social media with like all these big tickle bitty girls for men. I'm not talking about women, but for men. You're inundated with this tickle bitty girls, goth girls, all this stuff on social media, constantly. YouTube videos, like it just, especially like short form content, like all that stuff's always sexualized stuff, like all the time. So you have to like stay off social media, man. Like you can't, it'd be hard.
To me, how it affects those other like neuroscientific mechanisms, like the serotonin mechanism, like the rumination mechanism, like the self-referential mechanism. And that's the beauty of post-nut clarity, is that you nut, the opioid flood happens, and all of these things change on their own.
Booyah! All right. Post-nut clarity.